Welcome back to Debut Writers. In this series, we've been talking about how to structure your book from beginning to end. We focused on the three-act structure as outlined in Save the Cat Writes a Novel, our personal favorite if you didn't know that already. But we also want to touch on other story structures out there.
Another common structure is the hero's journey, or the nonlinear structures such as starting out of order and using flashbacks, which is my personal favorite. I love a good flashback. Something I do in my thriller novels most of all. But today we're also going to go through a few other of these and discuss which one is the best based off of what genre you're writing, because this kind of nonlinear structure is really the best for thriller novels, but not so much for a romance. So there's all sorts of kind of different things, but let's just discuss kind of how do all of these different structures align with Save the Cat Writes a Novel, because we kind of touched on this in the last episode about how I feel like she really pulls from all of these different structures that have been around a really long time to make like the ultimate structure.
I've looked at it as the ultimate structure and the simplified one. And I don't mean that in a negative way and that it's basic by any means. But she's pulled a lot of different story structures and then put them in a framework that is easy for all writers. And I would argue, especially debut writers who are really dedicated to the craft of their novel. They want to put in a lot of work and effort to ultimately make it the best it can be, and a lot of that is understanding story structure. Guaranteed, I totally understand that there are some people, they sit down and they have an idea, and I think when that happens, you can run with it, and you should, but ultimately you're going to be eventually coming back to structure. And if you don't have any sort of basic understanding of what story structure is, then that's where you end up having all of those revisions that we've talked about, and it can be agonizing and sometimes really discouraging too. But if you understand this, you understand the pacing really, and that's a big thing too, is that I think what she's taken with all of them helps outline what the pacing should be, because that does matter. I know some people out there might be like, oh, it doesn't matter, just go with the artistic feel of it. But it does matter. The pacing does matter for your readers, and you need to understand that. And so that's where I see like so many benefits from the way Save the Cat has outlined how you can structure your book.
I think another big benefit of it too is like, so if you take like the 7-point story structure, it's got 7 points that you need to hit in your novel. And if you kind of pair that up against hers, they're all there in the structure of Save the Cat Writes a Novel, but she just gives so much more of the in-between. So between the first pinch point and then the midpoint and then the second pinch point, she's telling you, she's like, this is when the bad guys close in. This is when all is lost. This is when you're having kind of another catalyst. So it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, I feel like she just gives you more. So when you are struggling to get from point A to point B, she's telling you, okay, this is how you can get there. Because I think that that's the thing too with writers. Like, if you know where you want to go and you're trying to get there, but you're like, I just can't get there. Going back to these structures can really help you, because it's like, oh, okay, I need to be kind of doing this right now in my novel, the fun and games. So in order to get to that midpoint. So like now I need to focus on, okay, what can be some fun and games before I get to that?
Even the phrasing itself that is used in Save the Cat, I think helps you as a writer dig into what the emotions are for those scenes, and then that is portrayed in your writing too, which is so important for your readers to feel the emotions or the tension or anything from that scene. They don't want it to be bland. So just her phrasing alone for the structure, to me, it helps like boost the creativity. It really gives you the idea of, okay, what needs to happen here? What does a catalyst look like? You know the difference if we're saying, okay, hey, this is your opening image, this is your theme, this is your setup, this is your catalyst. Like you can tell with whatever your idea is, okay, this is what needs to happen in all of those scenes. Or you're going to say to yourself, okay, that's not really a catalyst though. So like I need to dig deeper into what exactly is going to be that moment that sets my main character down this path.
And that's something I'm noticing too. So, I'm teaching a creative writing course and we're working on opening scenes right now. And just to think of like, okay, well, this opening scene was brought upon a catalyst. Like, think of Twilight. Like, her catalyst is she has to move to the middle of nowhere with her dad instead of living with her mom. But that's not the real catalyst, right? That's that opening scene. You've got like this change of her world, but it's not a true change. That catalyst is when she meets Edward, right? That's the big moment that propels the story forward. I love the smile on your face that you're like, oh yes, I remember. I just love it so much.
So it's so funny. I was just back home where I grew up and going through all of my old books, and I found all my Twilight books. And a part of me has really questioned whether or not to reread them. And I'm like, would this hold up for me today the way that I was so obsessed with it back then? And I get mixed. I've asked multiple people and I get mixed reviews on whether or not that's a good idea. Because some people are like, yeah, do it. The nostalgia of it is great. And then other people are like, no, no, no. It's not the same. Just don't do it. Just live. Just know that you loved it at that time and sit with that for the forever.
I think I'm gonna go with the second. I have gone back and watched like the movies, like when I'm having like a moment, but it's just, and I think it's not so much, and maybe this is different than going back and reading it, but it's really hard for me sometimes to go back and watch older movies that I was like obsessed with at a time because just the filmography, if that's the word you would use, is so bad. Like, it's like, it just isn't like, I remember it being so much cooler
I
than
didn't
that.
love the Twilight movies when they came out, but I loved the books.
See, she drove me nuts with the books.
But I should say, all that said, I was the person that went to the midnight premieres, and so it didn't really matter. I was in. I was all
Yeah.
in. They didn't
The
matter how
only
I
thing
felt.
the only movies I feel that hold for me that I can watch over and over again and they'll never feel old or anything is honestly the Harry Potter movies. I mean, because I've got young kids, we watch them every Christmas. I don't know why Christmas is the time we pick to watch Harry Potter, but that's like our tradition now. But every time I'm just like, it never gets old.
It really doesn't. I can always put it on. It's just, I totally agree. And Christmas time is also when I would say I tend to watch it. It's on TV a
Yeah.
lot too. So.
It is. It is. Anyways, so we digress back to the different story structures. So, when you're looking at, say, Harry Potter, and you have that follows kind of that classic hero's journey, which I think is another really big story structure that a lot of people know of. You're in the ordinary world, call to action, refusal to call. I mean, that literally sounds like opening scene, catalyst, debate. I mean, it's almost the same thing. And then the meaning of the mentor, classic B story, and then crossing that threshold, that's breaking into act two. You're making that choice. You're moving forward with that story. Test allies, enemies, challenging the relationship. That's fun and games. The approach, this could be potentially the midpoint, the preparation for the main challenge, or, it's still maybe that fun and games, the ordeal, reward. I'm like literally just reading these off. I don't know them by heart. Trust me. The road back, resurrection, and return to the elixir. Did I say that right? Elixir?
Elixir?
Elixir. Yes. The hero brings knowledge back to their world. That is literally the final, the final image.
Yeah, and so we alluded to that some of these are better for specific genres. So in case it's not obvious for the hero's journey, this one is great for fantasy, adventure, any sort of mythical sort of novel that you want to do. I love it. Lord of the Rings is like classic example, and follows that really well. So let's just go down
Star
these two.
Wars. I feel like the whole thing was based off of Star Wars.
Yeah. So let's talk about specific genres and what are some other structures that work well. So what about drama, literary fiction, or really complex narratives?
Okay, so this could be potentially the five act structure. And what the five act structure does is it's like it starts with like the introduction of characters and setting and the conflict. So it's kind of like opens up, but I feel like there's a lot more focus on the characters and the setting in that in those kinds of books. And then that rising action, we're kind of building up to that major that climax, but it's like that catalyst that seems to happen so soon in the saves the cat or the hero's journey where it's like the call to action and like you're being propelled into this new world and there's like a big moment. I feel like that doesn't really come in those kind of books until much later, more like that midpoint. And then the falling actions, right? The consequences of whether good or bad of that climax that just took place, which is like one big catalyst of the book much later in the book. And then, of course, the resolution. And so that's a little bit more for your literary fiction, your dramas, that kind of thing. It gives it less, in my opinion, pieces, but when you look at Saves the Cat Writes a Novel, there's some of those pieces that might not just fit if you're writing something like literary fiction or drama.
Right. And okay, I have a thought and I'm hoping I can convey it in coherent sentences. But the reason we're talking about how some of these are best for specific genres is because they truly won't line up well for others. So, so that example, the 5 act structure, is like probably not the best for some sort of fantasy. And we're probably going to get into this later, but I'll just bring it up now. This is where it is important to know, like, what else is being written in your genre. And
yes,
because that's going to tell you a lot about who your reader is and what their expectations are for that genre. And that's where, like, the pacing and everything is important because readers are going to expect a certain pace. And if you think about it, if you're writing in that genre, hopefully you like to read that genre. So yeah, I do think
like thrillers right now, it's all about multiple points of view. Like I don't think I've read a single thriller lately that's like super popular that doesn't have multiple points of view. I'm actually just reading The Housemaid.
Oh, I have that. I haven't read it yet, but I have it. Multiple points of view or like multiple timelines, really, really big for thrillers and mysteries right now.
And that's more of that like 7-point structure that we just talked about. Like you're starting with that hook, that opening scene of clearly the murder, right? Or whatever the big suspense is going to be.
Something has happened. Someone is missing.
Yes. And then in the middle, it's like instead of that midpoint being like the false victory or the false defeat, it's a completely shift in the story. And to me, though, that's the false defeat. Like you're building them up to be like, okay, clearly the killer is A. Like, duh, right? Just kidding. There's no way it's A. But now who could it be? And so I feel like that's kind of what a midpoint in a thriller potentially is. And so, and because you have that like second pitch point where it's like the heightened stakes and then the moment like leading up to like, are we going to ever find out what really happened,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a couple more just to mention. We can probably include some of these too, so if you want to dig into them more on your own time. But you have the snowflake method in media res. Did I say that right? Are we just totally non?
Yeah, we're butchering them. Sorry.
That's okay.
I don't know.
I'm really good at that. Non-linear structure, we kind of talked a little bit about that. We see that, you can see that sometimes with thrillers and mysteries too, but psychological dramas as well.
Which those are my favorite. I love, again, flashbacks. I don't think you could pick up a book that I've written that's not going to have a flashback.
Yeah, well, and I just finished The God of the Woods, and it is such a complex non-linear structure. But it never, in my opinion, never loses you. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, dang, this would have been so hard to structure in my point of view from the writing perspective. It paid off. It 100% paid off. But it was complex. It was really complex. And so that is too, one thing we didn't really touch on. But like if you want to experiment with some of these, you can do it in scenes. If you have like some different scenes and you're trying to play with, okay, how do these puzzle pieces fit together? You could do index cards. You could do the sticky note method. I think that that one is actually pretty common amongst like mystery thriller writers, is sort of the sticky note method, so that you can determine, okay, what is this structure really look like if it's not linear. The points of view too. I was talking not thriller, contemporary fiction and historical fiction, with an author, Randy Rebai, and he has a book that it had 4 points of view, but they
Remember this, yeah.
you have a nonlinear structure with that too, and it flips back and forth. And I go, so how did you do that? And he goes, well, my process was that I'm leaving some of the context out. He ended up writing, each person's point of view, and then he printed them all off in different colors, and then went back and replaced them to say, okay, like this makes sense here, this makes sense here. So I thought that was really interesting that he printed them all, wrote them, each person's point of view and their story, and then went back and fit it all together.
Yeah, and that's the thing sometimes too is if you're doing multiple points of view, to write like so I had to go back eventually and do that with a Lost Woman. Like, here's Nora's story, here's the mother's story, here's the girl's story, because there's 3 perspectives, and it's like it's really complex because everybody has their own story, but then you have to figure out, okay, at what point can I weave this in the best with this story? Like, to also too, I'm creating a little bit of like, who is the mother, who is the girl? There's a little bit of mystery behind those points of view. So it's like, I want to hint at it. So then it's like the transitions I make have to be a certain way. I'm clearly a sadist because I'm doing this whole process again with my next book, where I've got 3 perspectives and it's 3 different stories, and I'm trying to edit and rearrange it right now, and I'm deeply regretting it because I'm like, oh my God, where did I leave off? Oh, Jesus. Okay. What's the best time to pull this in? I don't know. Like, I don't want to lose the reader, but also you need to know this information before that information. It's very difficult.
I mean, if it was easy, everyone would do it. So, but that comes a lot with that genre and like you want to leave the red herrings and unreliable notes and things in there for people to pick up on. That's part of all of it. It really is like a very intricate puzzle.
And I also think that, again, that this is why, so I return to structure when I'm trying to figure out when to make these points and when to bring this up and when to show this, because that's what can happen is you can have these pitfalls. You can lose the clarity in the narrative. Your writers can get very confused. I'm working with an author right now, and it's all over the place. And I'm like, okay, we need a structure. We need to know what's happening, just basic beginning, middle, and ending of your story, because it's kind of all over the place. And I thought it was a memoir, and she's like, no, it's a self-help. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, we need to shift completely, because this reads like a memoir. It does not read like a self-help. So she's like, no, I just want the memoir part to be kind of like a case study. And I'm like, okay, we need to change. I hate to tell a writer this. I'd be like, so we need to change most of it. I hate having to say that.
It's hard to hear.
Thanks for coming to me. We're going to change everything.
It's hard to hear, but at the same time, as a writer, especially if you haven't put in the time, if you really did, you just had an idea and you ran with it, and that's good. That's fine. That is a solid starting point. So I don't want to make it seem like it's not, but just know that if you really do want to make it the best it can be, and then you bring on an author coach or anyone to do that, beta readers, all of that, listen to that feedback to ultimately make the final product the best it can be. I know that that's one thing I've sort of seen too with an author, maybe not quite on that level, but just based on this discussion where he really he structured it more as a literary fiction, kind of novel, but but that's not what the genre is, and that's not what it
Uh-oh.
wants it to be. And I'm like, okay, well, the pacing is really off for what this genre is. It's not necessary. It's not really literary fiction, so we need to restructure it a little
Yeah.
bit. And that's, I mean, I get it. Like, that's hard to hear, and sometimes you're trying to balance too many things, but that's why you bring in people to help and to coach you through all of that, and just to give you a different perspective, because I mean, we see that with everything. It's helpful to have someone else's perspective.
Yes. One that I really like that we've recently read was we had her on the show, Sloane Harlow. She was, I think, in the last series, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes. And she wrote Everything We Never Said. And it was a structure that used letters and diary entries. Again, I it starts with an E. I'm gonna butcher the word because I didn't look it up beforehand. I should have. But
Epistolary?
yes.
That's how you say that, right?
How would you say it?
Isn't it epistolary?
Yeah, sure. Don't judge us.
Maybe.
But it actually says these ones are great for like romance and young adult specifically. And hers is a young adult thriller. And she even said on there her favorite part was writing Haley's diary, which if you haven't read her book, you should go read it. It was really good.
It's so entertaining. Oh,
So good. I
yeah.
remember the moment I text Bree and I was like, I called it. I am texting this to you now before I read it. So when I am correct, you know that I knew
Talk
beforehand.
and talk about pacing. I thought the pacing of her book was really, really well done
Yes.
with that. So,
The red herrings too. She did a good job. Everybody's name started with S.
I know.
I was like, that right there makes you know that it's not the S you think it is because everybody's name has some kind of
Everyone,
S in
everyone.
it.
It is good. Yeah, I do really like that tactic. It's good for romance. It can be good. That's like a YA thriller esque with a romance thriller, if you will. So,
I think
um,
with YA too, they want to be people who are reading that, like again, back to Twilight, it was in first person. I think people love to be in that mindset of a teenager. I don't know why. I'm obsessed with tween stuff too. But it's like there's something about being in the mind of a teenager because I guess you just feel like you go through so much and you're trying to learn so much about yourself. And it's like first love and first this and first that. And everybody loves that, I guess. But
I think a lot of people do. I've had a couple conversations with Jenny Myers saying about that too, who also writes YA, and it's just, I mean, it is interesting. A lot of people, but I mean, I'm the same way. Like I like to read all of those too. It is, I don't know. I don't know if it's like maybe sometimes a nostalgia thing looking back, but it's also YA is just that age range is such a period of growth too. And at the end of the day, like we are all always going through that just in a totally different space. And so maybe it's sort of also a connection, relatability, people going through big changes. You're going through big, I don't know. I think there's a lot of reasons.
yeah, yeah. But both of those authors are fabulous. Y'all should check them out. And we've had them on the show, of course, because they're amazing. But the only other one I think we haven't mentioned that I put here on my little list that I'm checking out is the circular structure. And this one's all about character driven stories. So, like with it ends where it begins. But if you think of it, that's kind of that opening scene versus that final scene, showing that character growth. So if again, I feel like she just took like the best pieces of all of these structures and kind of put them together. So with that mindset, as you go through, okay, I need to structure my story and I'm writing this way and this is the genre I'm in. As you're going through her pieces, she does say you don't necessarily have to do them in this particular order. You can kind of switch it up a little bit. Like you said, like, what is it, God in the Woods? I'm going to have to read that one. I'm going to put it on my list.
The Garden of the
Um,
Woods, yeah, by Liz Moore.
a very complex structure and a very complex story. So I think the best thing as a writer, as we talked about being a debut writer specifically, is to at least understand and know these structures. That's something I didn't know going in with my first book, and it shows um, so badly that I did
You're so
not.
hard on yourself. You're so
I
critical of yourself.
I am. Well, if I don't do it, somebody else will. That's kind of how I
Just
tell
beating them
you.
to the punch. It's
I do the same thing with my kids, by the way,
I
too.
do.
I'm like, my kids are horrible. They're like, your kids are great. I'm like, well, I mean, I'm just beating you to the punch because they're going to do something in a minute and you're going to think, wow, our kids are really bad.
Oh, I do it all the time. I'm like, this is really bad, but here you go.
I
we should
know,
be,
I know. We're
we
always
should
so
do that.
self-deprecating. I
No,
feel like
no,
that's a
don't do.
requirement of a writer.
I'm, I'm really like, I will be cheerleader for everybody else, but when it's myself, I'm like, this is
Yes.
terrible. Here you go. Um,
Yes.
what was it? Oh, kind of what we've talked about, I believe, in this series is like there is flexibility with these, but it is a lot easier to be flexible and to quote break the mold. And I'm not saying toss the mold out the window because I do think it's there for a reason, but if you want to break the mold, it is a lot easier to do that if you have an understanding of story structure, and you can get creative with it, and I think come with that flexibility really once you have it laid out in a way that makes sense, and we can see, okay, this is the story. We have a good beginning, middle, end. We hit all of the key points. And then you can really start to figure out, okay, well, this might actually be more impactful if I just shift this slightly. That's also, my brain functions that way. If yours doesn't, then take that with a grain of salt. But I do think it is like, it's a lot easier to be flexible with it and to quote break the mold once
Hmm.
you actually have it in place.
Yes. And, kinning towards the professionals. So when you do sign on with an editor, if they are just like, hey, look, this story structure, like there are issues with it, know that they're coming from a very professional standpoint of, I read a
Trust
lot
them.
of this. Yes, trust them. Trust
Like,
them. They
please,
know what they're talking about.
yes, please, for everything, like, please, when you work with an editor, whether you're self-publishing and you hire a great editor, or you're traditionally publishing and then please trust your editor.
Yes. Which
Please.
will lead us into our next series, by the way, is going to be all about editing. Like the editing you do first, the editing your friends do, because you'll have your friends do some, and then the editing you actually hire and have a professional do. So that'll
But
be fun to kind of like dive into that next season.
yes, but before that, so we talked a lot about different story structures, and we thought it would be really awesome to have another guest author come on to talk about what his writing process was like. So that is D.L. Jennings, the author of the High Glade series. It is a trilogy that just wrapped up this past summer, so it's September 2024. It just wrapped up a couple of months ago, and he joins us to talk all about his entire process with writing, how what he went through, the idea, everything. It's a fantastic conversation.
So good.
He's just fun to talk to as well, but I think that we can all learn a lot from him. So join us next episode for our final episode of this series, and then you'll be able to structure your story. There we go.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.